Today we're going to have a look at the timeline for the abolition of the slave trade, which leads to this abolition of slave trade in 1807, not the abolition of slavery, but just of the slave trade. And we're going to start right at the beginning in actually 1739, which although is before our period, we start to see that there is a humanitarian movement, that people are starting to care about other people in society. And so I've included this on the timeline because the first foundling hospital is established in 1739, and I think that's quite a telling fact on how the government is starting to change their opinion. Now, we start to see the real kind of push towards the abolition of the slave trade in 1767, and that's with Granville Sharp. Now, he's a key player, but he's a little bit obscure in the fact that he doesn't like to be as public, which is why we remember the likes of Wilberforce and Clarkson and Equiano actually more than we do Granville Sharp. But he himself helps out with a court case for the likes of this man called Jonathan Strong. And Jonathan Strong is a slave who has been beaten by his master, and his former master tries to force him to be sold back into slavery in the colonies, and he doesn't allow this to happen. And because of this, what actually ended up happening was that a law got passed that meant that you couldn't force slaves to go back to the colonies once they had arrived in Britain. And that was quite a turning point in one sense, because Britain got to be seen as a little bit of a refuge then, and it really helped with the likes of Jonathan Strong, who won this court case and didn't have to return or be sold. Now, Granville Sharp from this point starts working through and adding a lot more. There is other developments as well with government. In 1772, slavery in Britain had been abolished, but still had black servants. So again, although slavery has been abolished, it's the slave trade that we're dealing with. And a lot of Britain didn't see this as an issue because they weren't necessarily dealing with it. They felt it was currency. They felt it was trading an object for an object, not necessarily in the sense that we would hold that belief today. Then we start to see in 1783 a huge year for things. So we've got initially the Zong case. 133 slaves are thrown overboard, and this is all as a bit of an insurance scam. Because what effectively is the case is they believe that they could get more money for killing the slaves by throwing them overboard and claiming they've been lost to sea. Now, this does go to trial. It's thrown out as an insurance case, so they don't have to pay, and it never got deemed as murder. But Equiano and Sharp in particular felt this was a huge issue, and they caused legal uproar. They started trying to present how bad this was to people, and it's one of the first kind of publicity scandals that we start to see with this. We also have the Religious Society of Friends, which is the Quakers one. Now, the Quakers have been working hard on this before, and the Quakers are the foundation of the kind of abolition movement. They are, however, not seen as brilliant because they are a little bit odd, a little bit weird. We call them nonconformists, and that's very much the case here, that they have some success, but it's limited. I've also put here the end of American War of Independence, which, although it seems quite early on, this evoked a new sense of freedom amongst people, where people were arguing about whether America should be free from Britain. We started to see, should actually slaves be free from others? Americans shouldn't be slaves of Britain, so why should we have slaves at all? And that new sense of freedom starts to establish itself with this. And then we also have, again, some more success with the Quaker Yearly Meeting, a petition signed by 273 people, and the 23-person committee set up. It's a big year. 1784, we have 10,000 copies of The Case of Our Fellow Creatures, the Oppressed Africans. That is, again, a Quaker publication. And so, therefore, again, shows how successful they are. The Quakers knew very well that propaganda was going to help them. And then we have Wilberforce. Now, Wilberforce has already started kind of coming onto the scene, starting to get interested in this. But in particular, he helps his friend James Ramsay, a ship surgeon, to publish a pamphlet on the experience of slaves in the colonies. First-hand testimonies are going to be really important across the whole of this. In then 1786, we have Thomas Clarkson. Now, Thomas Clarkson, as we know, is the kind of main campaigner. He is the driving force behind this, and a lot of people argue that he is the main reason that Wilberforce gets involved. He is the kind of campaigner, and Wilberforce is going to be the political spearhead. And both of these guys join the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. This is full of what we would call social reformers and also different religions. And so this is where we get our Quakers, our evangelicals, all our kind of people start to join into this one. We also, though, have a black group. Now, Equiano joins the Sons of Africa group at the same time, and this is a group of 12, and they are educated and freed black men. Remember, Equiano himself bought his freedom for £40 and was able then to go on and publish his works in 1789. Now, in 1788, we start to see some implications on economy here. So, for instance, 12 of the 30 leading merchant houses had gone bankrupt. This was because America wasn't paying its debts, and so there are some economic issues here. And I'm going to put all these as kind of economic. Same with the Sons of Africa. They're marching on Parliament. So, again, we're starting to get this political following. And a lot of this culminates in the Dolben Act. And the Dolben Act is very much the regulations on the ships. So, for instance, this included that the slave owner had to have done a slave ship trade before, that the workers and the crew should be paid a bonus, should less than 3% of the ship die. And it's still weird, it's still very strange regulations, but it's just trying to improve them, trying to limit how many can go on it, and it has to have like a doctor, for instance. So it's very much trying just to make it a little bit more formal, a little bit more hard to just go about it the wrong way. And then in 1789, we have Wilberforce's first speech. Now, his speeches will mark a continuation then, pretty much until the abolition of the slave trade, where he starts to present bills all the time. But his first speech in particular highlighted this issue, though he has been criticised that he wanted gradual abolition. And so therefore it wasn't as inspiring as we might think, or as radical as we might think. And often it was late in the parliamentary session. And that meant that a lot of people were kind of like packing away, not really interested. And so there is some criticism there, but that's when he does his first speech. And also the same year, we have the publication of the interesting narrative of the life of Ludo Equiano. So again, we have both kind of our white campaigners and our black campaigners all working together at the same time. In 1791 to 1799, Wilberforce introduces a bill every single year. So as I said, this kind of first speech then marks when he starts to present all his bills. They are constantly rejected, but again, the pressure, the consistency helps to build on this. And then we have something different, and that is the Haitian Revolution that goes on. Now, this is called Saint-Domingue originally, so don't be confused. It is the same thing as what we've looked at in your booklets. And this was successful in overthrowing both slavery on the island, but also French colonial rule. This is a French colony, not a British one, but it kind of spearheaded and led the way for others to follow. So I haven't put the other slave revolts on here, as that's one of the biggest, but you could add those on because you'll start to see that there is then that kind of push from different revolts in different places, and that really told the public that they didn't want to be slaves, which you'd think would be obvious, but they didn't necessarily know that, but also put economic pressures on things because you had to have guards and you had to have ways of stopping the revolts, and also the implications on the actual trade itself. So it kind of marks a turning point. Though there are criticisms that it did make the slaves look more savage, and therefore some people did turn away from it. 1792, the Colonial Assembly resolved to abandon the use of metal collars in Jamaica. So this is starting to kind of respond to some of the revolts and things like that, trying to limit it a little bit, so a bit of a chance. And again, we still got the humanitarian campaign pushing that 519 petitions that year alone had happened. And then the French do something weird. In 1794, the new French government abolished slavery, but only a few years later, they then reintroduced it with Napoleon. And actually, this is a good turning point for us, for Britain, because actually a lot of people saw it as their patriotic duty to do exactly the opposite of the French because they were at war with them. And so by him reintroducing it, a lot of people started to turn against it. They saw it as a French thing, they saw it as a tyrannical thing, and they didn't want to be involved. So as the British patriot, we would instead go against it. 1804, Wilberforce reissued his bill and he gets support of William Pitt. However, it had to be gradual again. It had to be a gradual ban. And so it's not as radical as we would hope, but it is accepted. It gets support of William Pitt, and that is one of the reasons why it gets pushed through. And in 1807, this is the success, but it is only a success in the slavery. So I'm going to put just an end to the trade itself, okay? Basically, the trade in enslaved people. It didn't free people who were already slaves. Okay, so it's not a case of that actually getting done. That gets done much, much later in the 1830s. But it is a start. Now, there's a lot of information on there anyway, which is why I've not added loads of bits. Remember, this topic is much more about what do you think helped to cause the end of it, much more the debate and the argument rather than the facts necessarily. So have a look at that. It's all intermixed, all the economic arguments, all the humanitarian arguments, all the ideas of new morality and theories of freedom, with also the slave revolts. So it's all very much intermixed, but it's very interesting to think what causes this point, what ends up with the 1807 abolition of the slave trade, and what's your thoughts? Go through your booklet, add anything extra you think should be added, go through anything you're not sure on, and hopefully this will be useful for your revision.